Hi, this is Paul. Michaela hasn't dropped a lot of videos over the last couple of years. Probably she's been busy being a wife and a mother and starting Peterson Academy and running Jordan's businesses and stuff. But then this thing dropped today.
Dad, welcome to my podcast.
Thanks for the invitation.
And welcome to moving to America formally.
I guess that's what happened, isn't it?
It is.
Uh-oh. Is this the big announcement?
I mean, why not? Might as well let the people know.
Yeah.
How do you feel about it?
There are decided advantages to being here. I like where I'm living a lot. It's close to you. We have lots of work to do. But the issue with the college of psychologists is very...
Anyway, all that stuff. So I sent Rick a message, said, Rick, we got him, Rick. He's living here in America. So then Rick said, well, maybe we should send him a housewarming gift. I said, no, he's living in Arizona. He needs a house cooling gift. And so we eventually settled on, let's see if I can pull it up. Where did I put our house cooling gift for Jordan Peterson? There we go. This is what we thought would pass well in Arizona. A pet iguana that he could take for walks, and very good for the hot Arizona climate. And for those of you who live in Europe, America is a big country with lots of different climates. And where Jordan and then Michaela's talked before about the fact that they settled in Miami, but they had all of they were in Nashville and then Miami and now Arizona. So, well, an iguana would be a good thing. So Jordan's book is out. Apparently it's #1 on a particular New York Times bestsellers list, and you don't really need to go to Daily Wire to hear all the details of the Exodus series. At least if you want to hear from Jordan, the other guys are on not the Exodus series, the gospel seminar. But he gives here towards the end a really nice, succinct articulation of sort of the main theme that he's working on in the book, and it's a pretty nice, succinct package.
It's one of responsible, upward seeking sacrifice. And that's true. It's true.
Vervaeke gave a nice definition in the second episode of the gospel seminar, and he talked about life. Life is always seeking upward. They were talking about the question of, what are you looking for? What are you seeking? And Vervaeke says, what are you seeking? Right. And life is defined by seeking. I thought this was a really helpful little insight. Again, one of the nice things about the gospel seminar is it's sort of a popcorn experience, in that you just get these popping of insights through. You have a number of people around the table, and they're throwing things, and some of the ideas will be new and some of the ideas won't necessarily be new. Fire and other self-organizing things don't seek out the conditions that produce and protect their existence. Life is by definition seeking, and that's what distinguishes life from non-life. Now, it's not the only thing that distinguishes life from non-life, but I thought, again, it was a good observation.
True. It's not merely a religious proclamation, although it is that. It's inevitably the case. It's the case by definition. Here's one way of understanding that. Attention is sacrificial. Why? Because when you attend to one thing, there is an infinite number of other things that you are not attending to. Right? When you do one thing, there's an infinite number of other things that you're not doing. You've sacrificed all those other possibilities to that one thing. What is that one thing that you're sacrificing everything to? Is it your...
That's a good reason to consider where we put our attention. Again, McGilchrist has been talking about this quite a bit too. A lot of where the conversation is going with respect to how to understand consciousness and cognition and to make sense of humanity is sort of through this lens of attention.
Your whim? Well, that's not going to make you very popular with your tomorrow self or with anybody who might want to be around you.
Yeah.
Like, what's the aim of the sacrifice? Okay, there's more. Community is based on sacrifice. Well, why? Well, when you're 3 and you learn to take turns, what are you doing when you take turns? You're sacrificing your turn. Why? So that your friend can have a turn. Why? So that you have a friend. Right. And then maybe you have a bunch of friends. Now you have a community or a tribe. Are you better off? Yeah, way better off. You're not lonesome. You've got people around to help you. You've got people around to take care of. Right? That's a great deal. And then your little tribe becomes a town or a city, and then it becomes a nation. And it's one nation under God. And the God at the top of all that is the principle of, it's in part the principle of the sacrifice upon which community is founded. That's why Christ's life is the ultimate sacrifice, right? And that just happens to be true. It just turns out that that's true. It's the sacrifice upon which the community is founded. Well, we even know that because look what we've done. This is the structure of a European town, right? Classic European town. There's a church or a cathedral at the center, often the highest building in town by design. It's the center. At the center of the church is an altar. At the center of the altar is a sacrifice. Why? Because the community is founded on sacrifice. It's like, oh, and we were doing that. We were acting that out. No one knew. It's like, turns out we knew what we were doing all along. We act out things that we don't understand all the time. And
lots of stuff right in there. So it's a nice way to sort of walk through it. Now, again, going all the way back to Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, people always get confused about what do I mean by God number 1 and God number 2? Well, there's God number 1. It's the Arenic God. And the Babylon Bee had a little joke. There it is. God announces he believes in Jordan Peterson, but only as a metaphorical idea. And it's that God number 1-ness that everybody notices when he does this, because again, this is a point that I've been making for years in the video, a shift had happened. I love to tell this little story. If you read Chuck Colson's Born Again, there's this great scene that I will paraphrase when Chuck Colson excitedly comes home to his wife and says, honey, I've become a Christian. And she kind of looks at him and says, I thought we were Episcopalian. And you sort of get the sense of, no, because when Chuck Colson found Jesus after all of the drama with the Nixon, with the Watergate cover up, and he's going to go to jail, and Nixon is fine letting Chuck Colson take the fall for him. Chuck Colson finds the living God, finds a personal God, finds a personal relationship with God. And that then sort of becomes the image from the 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, and then it's just fully God number 2, God the agentic God versus God number 1, the Arenic God. And Peterson keeps talking in that way, sort of about the Arenic God.
And some of them are very profound things, and that happens to be one of them. So it's even at the beginning of, there's this weird idea in John, right at the beginning of the Gospel of John, that Christ is the Word of God that's there at the beginning of time. Now, the beginning of time is a weird idea in the biblical corpus because the God who operates at the beginning of time is outside of time. So it's not exactly the beginning, it's the beginning and now and the future. So God is conjuring the world out of potential at the beginning of time, now and forever. Okay, so there's something happening there, this wrestling with potential. That is the way the world is engendered. And human beings do that. That's why we're considered made in the image of God.
And that's a pretty good way. I liked what he did there to try to give a sense of, now very much he was talking about God number 2 because he's using God agentically instead of arenically. But he's also noticing that time works in a funny way in the Bible. And again, if you listen carefully, if you read carefully the Bible, you'll notice that funny things are happening with time and it's always moving. And I thought what he did there was really quite helpful.
God, things to do with conjuring the world out of time. the God who operates at the beginning of time is outside of time. So it's not exactly the beginning, it's the beginning and now and the future. So God is conjuring the world out of potential at the beginning of time, now and forever. Okay, so there's something happening there, this wrestling with potential. That is the way the world is engendered.
And, you know, it was interesting because I remember listening to him and Sam Harris, and they're getting to the end of the first one, and Sam Harris is like, I really want to know what this God is that you talk about. And Peterson opens up his Surface as his notebook and starts reading this long list of things. And Sam Harris just is completely not understanding what he's talking about. But it's all of these ways in which the Hebrew God has displaced, as Ezekiel Kaufman noted, the Hebrew God has displaced the meta-divine realm. And in that way, there is no... God can make something apart from himself, but that thing that is apart from God, what I noticed when Jordan said that is I remembered all of these very early reformational statements of faith that say things like, if God for a moment stops withholding the universe, it goes away. And basically what happens later on when deism begins to develop, that God then increasingly becomes a thing. And as I had my conversation with Larry Chapp yesterday, one of the things that I learned as I was trying to figure out Roman Catholic transubstantiation, and I was reading Brett Sockold's book, is that the realization that, oh yeah, all of the implication of this stuff is that God is not another thing that's in the world. And of course, that's where I get my Tolkien illustration that if Frodo would look for Tolkien in Middle-earth, where would he find him? And in a sense, it's both nowhere and everywhere, because in a limited way, an analogy is Tolkien is to Middle-earth as God is to this world. You can't say that Tolkien and Middle-earth are the same thing. No, Tolkien, Middle-earth is a creation of Tolkien. Tolkien is far greater and beyond Middle-earth, but without Tolkien, there is no Middle-earth. Now, of course, you can see that this analogy gets stretched, and because Tolkien then instantiates Middle-earth in a story which gets published and goes out, and in human terms, Tolkien, the sub-creator, is then releases this creation out into the broader creation that God has made.
Human beings do that. That's why we're considered made in the image of God. Okay, what are we doing? We're performing the sacrifices upon which the foundations of order are predicated. With every glance we take, with everything we attend to or don't attend to, with every word we utter, we're wrestling the world of potential into being. That is what we're doing. And what is it that confronts us? Is it the determinate material order? In part, because things are concretized. But everything that's concretized is still rife with potential. You know, this is a book, unless I pick it up and swat you with it, in which case it's instantly a weapon. It's like everything has its realm of potential around it, right? So we're surrounded by potential, and that's what our consciousness focuses on. You ignore everything that's predictable. Mm-hmm. You wrestle with the tohu vabohu, the potential that's there in front of you. And we do that in the microcosm, but it's the embodiment of the same principle of sacrifice that the Word of God uses at the beginning of time to cast the world into order. It's like, yeah, turns out that's true. So,
whoa.
No kidding. No kidding. It's like,
so
I have no idea
mind-blowing.
what we're going to do when we realize that these stories are true. Because that's different than believing them, right? Because that's been the Christian insistence forever. You have to believe, which you do. Like, look, you have to have faith. And people might say, I'm only going to act in accordance with the evidence. It's like, okay, so let's say you go out on a date and you fall in love with the girl you're out with and you decide to get married. It's like, what? That's from the evidence, is it? That's why you're going to get married, because of the evidence. You have no idea what your marriage is going to be like. You don't have the foggiest notion of who it is that you are now tangled up with. You don't have a clue. And so why do you get married? Well, because it's an act of sacrifice. All other women are off the table. It's an act of faith. And the same thing happens when you move to a new city or when you take a new job. The evidence is not there. Now, that doesn't mean you can make stupid decisions, but all the time when we're pursuing the adventure of our life, always, it's an act of faith. It's not an adventure otherwise. If you know with 100% certainty that your bet will pay off, well, first of all, you're being an automaton in some ways. And second, there's no excitement in that. It's so interesting that the act of faith, this is by definition, it's something I cover in detail in the book. The act of faith is by definition the adventure of life. I mean, who would have ever guessed that? Why do you have faith? So that weirdly exciting things can happen to you all the time. So that's something else I tried to detail in this book is the relationship between truth and adventure. And that's such fun. It's so fun to understand that. So let's say you decide that you're just going to say what you think. You know, like not carelessly and not self-servingly, but that's just your rule. If someone asks you a question, you just say what you believe to be true. Okay, so that's a sacrificial gesture. Why? Well, because you don't get to decide what you want for the outcome. You know, because I could be sitting here thinking, well, I should tell Michaela what she wants to hear because, you know, maybe she'll make a business deal with me then. Yeah. It's like, no, you don't get to do that. You get to say what you think. And then you'd have no idea what's going to happen. No idea. And that's ridiculously entertaining.
Or I suppose sometimes you do know what's going to happen if you say what you think, which is why people avoid it, right? Or they think they know.
But it's interesting how it's been interesting watching him for a number of years and watching these things sort of evolve and grow. Now, back when I saw this is a little while ago that I saw this, but I want to come back to it. I was going to skip the Stephen Hicks video, but then, as usually what happens, if there's stuff in these videos, more of you watch. Between all of you out there watching stuff, if there's a non-overlapping groups, people skip different things, but then if there's something in it and they watch my stuff, they think, oh, you'd be interested in that, I'll send that to you. And I was heading out to Massachusetts, so I thought I'd watch it. And then basically I knew that Stephen Hicks was making videos sort of on the culture war stuff. And so I thought, oh, this is just going to be another culture war video where they just go back and forth over the culture war stuff. But actually, as I started watching, okay, Hicks is a philosopher by trade. And I thought he was doing a nice job of laying out the philosophy. It was also very interesting because he seemed to be one of the people that could sort of hold Jordan Peterson at bay in his excitement. Stephen Hicks would just keep talking and Jordan would have to do a lot of listening. But then at this point in the video, I thought Jordan gave a tremendous framing of emotions. And I thought this was really, really good. I remember not early on in my ministry, but I remember here in Sacramento, emotions are obviously a big deal in pastoral care because people have them, especially within church. Sometimes people sort of deify their emotions. And so trying to sort of get correctly calibrated what emotions are is a really important thing, because emotions are important because we learn things from them. They're good signs. They shouldn't be masters, but we also shouldn't ignore the data that we're getting from our emotions. And I thought Jordan really quite nicely laid it out in this piece.
Feedback loops, right? And there's variant forms of those upper level hierarchies. But those forms compete across time. And the more successfully they compete across time, the more they become instantiated physiologically. That's a Baldwin effect selection mechanism. The higher order...
And we've talked about the Baldwin effect a number of times. That came up in his conversation with Richard Dawkins.
Interpretive structures that produce the best reproductive outcome across time are more likely to become automated at a instinctual level. Emotions would be like that. Like they're not as...
And this he's using the word automation. subsidiary focal processing, where again, the conversation I had with Esther Meek, with riding a bike, with learning to swim, we take all of these things and we are able to sort of program ourselves through ritual and habit to be able to respond. We have all these different words for it. We have muscle memory, but we have many, many more systems in our body that deal with it. And all of our systems are a combination of what we've inherited, what our family groups have imprinted upon us, have mapped upon us. But then he talks directly about emotions. It was just a tiny little saying, but I thought I hadn't heard such a nice little, like, saying what emotions are just right there and how they function. I also, because I make videos, I pay attention to things like camera angles. And so here, maybe this is his new house, I don't know, or a new set or something, but I made a quip on Twitter about the Phantom of the Opera because it's so dramatic. And then you have this fisheye lens and Stephen Hicks is sitting there like it was such a dramatic set. And then some of the new thumbnails that they're using, I just think it's funny.
Automatized as spinal reflexes, but they're quite automatized because the sets of emotions that human beings have are very similar: anger, fear, surprise, joy, etc.
And at our retreat in Connecticut, one of the things that Michael Sartori mentioned was the C.S. Lewis essay Transpositions, which is a super helpful little essay. You can find it in that audio catalog of C.S. Lewis essays. I don't know where else you can find it. I'm sure if you Google it, C.S. Lewis Transpositions. Lewis makes the point that human beings, it's a very similar point to what Peterson is making here, that human beings have limited functions and limited capacities. And so these limited capacities have to serve multiple ends and multiple purposes. And so we have to keep that in mind when we're thinking about how people work.
Everyone feels those. When and where is automatized because the sets of emotions that human beings have are very similar: anger, fear, surprise, joy, etc. Everyone feels those. When and where is different, but the fact of the emotions is the same. Then imagine that this is something like the domain of iterable and playable games. So imagine that there's a variety of different interpretive frameworks that we lay upon more basic sensory data, but that a relatively small subset of those interpretive frameworks has the capacity for sustainable improvement. So you could think about this in the context, let's say, of a marital relationship, right? There's a very large number of ways that your marriage can go wrong. Like an indefinite number of ways that your marriage can go wrong. But then there's a constrained number of ways that it will go right. And that's because it's a difficult target. Imagine that the specifications are something like, for your marriage to be successful, the micro routines and the macro routines have to be such that you're voluntarily okay with them and your wife is voluntarily okay with them, and they bond you more tightly together across time, and this would be the optimal situation, as you lay them out together, they improve. Okay, and so you could imagine that as the basis for an optimized contractual relationship of any form. But then you could also imagine that the number of variants of the way that you can treat each other for all of those conditions to be met would be low. There's a very small number of voluntary playable games that are iterable across large spans of time that improve as you play them.
Right.
Okay, so then you'd get an evolutionary pressure as well on the domains of possible philosophy, right? That they'd fill up something like a space. And that seems to me to be reflective. It's weird because that's also reflective of an empirical reality, but it's not the reality that's associated with basic sense data. It's more the fact that there is a finite number of complex games that are voluntary playable and that improve. And that's also a fact, right? I mean, and that would be, I think that's partly why there are patterns of ethics that tend to emerge in many different cultures, even independently, right? It's and that also makes a mockery in some ways of a really radical relativism. It's like, it's not the value space, the philosophical space isn't relativistic because there's a finite number of interpretive frameworks that.
All right, have I lost what I'm looking for here? Just had to go ahead a little bit more. So here we go.
And go with that problem because I'll object to your objection and see where that goes. So I would say a narrative is a description of the structure through which we see the world, right? That's a different claim. So because it's not a narrative until I tell it to.
But then you've dropped reality out of the picture.
Well, that's exactly why I want to have this discussion, because I don't want to. I think it's very dangerous. It's kind of obvious to drop reality out of the situation. But you're right that the danger of the postmodern formulation which is that we see the world through a narrative, let's say, is exactly that, is that the reality drops out of the equation. There's nothing but the text, let's say. Now, like if there's a competition between narratives for their functionality, let's say, reproductive and otherwise, that would go some way to addressing that problem, because there'd be a Darwinian competition between narrative structures that would prioritize some over others. And so, but...
Okay. Because this is what I wanted to get to after the emotion thing, because this is the context in which he talks about the emotion stuff. And this is helpful because what was helpful with Hicks here is Hicks wanted to challenge this question: do we see through a narrative? And now it's hard to what Peterson is basically trying to do is conceptualize this in a way that we can see it.
The description part, the idea that it's a description is relevant. So imagine that wolves in a pack, at a perceptual level, the wolves distinguish the rank order of the wolf that they're seeing. And they do that extremely rapidly. Highly social animals are unbelievably good at that. And so the story of the dominance, the story of the hierarchy of the wolves is implicit in the perception of the wolves. And if you describe that, it's a story, but it's not a story.
So there's sort of a pre-story, and this actually connects up with the potentiality that he was talking about too. You would imagine that when the wolves look at each other, and we have words for this, when they size each other up. Obviously, wolves that have had experience with other wolves know, they've seen the sparring, they've seen the challenges. And of course, it's not just physical strength, it's determination. You could have a smaller wolf best a larger wolf if the smaller wolf is more skilled or more determined or has certain attributes that the larger wolf doesn't have. It's just not near size. But wolves carry this rank order with them, and human beings do this too all the time. But it's very much in play, and I don't mean that play in terms of amusement, but a wolf might decide to make a play to up himself in the rank. And what Jordan notices there is that there's something that we use stories to describe. There's a wonderful point too in the second episode of the Gospel Seminar. I really liked the first half hour of episode 2 of the Gospel Seminar. I thought they were really hitting on a bunch of things. James Orr says, they're talking basically about this fourfold sense of Scripture. James Orr says it's not a zero-sum game, so the church fathers are always stressing that there's so-called fourfold sense of Scripture, the idea that you've got a literal sense, which might be historical. It might be just reading it in accordance with the genre that presents itself, the kind of reading of the text. There's an analogical, which would license more a sense of allegory or analogical reading along the lines of what we were discussing earlier. Then it goes a little bit further. Then there's the moral. The moral, it's sort of an instructive. How can you improve yourself? Then finally, there's more sort of the Neoplatonic, the anagogical. This is a way of trying to release the soul to higher things, lift up our spiritual vision. And there's no sense there's a kind of competition between these four senses of the story. It gets collapsed in the Reformation and the Enlightenment. And again, I was dealing with all of this stuff when I first started making videos. it gets collapsed because Europe is tearing themselves out. And so they're looking for a common basis by which they can stop warring and start agreeing. And there you basically have the foundations of the Enlightenment and modernity. And it was a success in many ways. I was just watching the Benjamin Boyce Vocal Distance distributist conversation in that. And I thought it was interesting, at least the first hour and a half that I've seen of the 4-hour conversation. And then Greg Hurwitz says, a story is a story precisely because the information it's conveying can't be conveyed through other means. Jesus teaches all in parables, not all in parables, but in a lot of parables and in stories. And so the engagement is in a story. It's like I could list out the principles, and the point is, there are things that can be best communicated in a story. It isn't that they can't be at all communicated other ways, but the story is the proper container for communicating that. And I think that's true in terms of the wolf analogy. That now wolves don't tell stories, but there is knowledge in the wolves. It's unarticulated by language. It's unmediated by language. And this very much gets into what Peterson had said to Michaela in terms of, we know so much more than we can articulate because we act out that more. He makes that point. I remember him making that point at the first lecture of the Genesis series about what is religion. And he talked about, acting that out. And so much of what we do is we watch each other act out things, and then we notice things, and then maybe some of these things we can put into language. Language and stories have certain capacities to preserve and convey, but it's always lossy compression because everything can't be captured into it. And again, Vervaeke's 4 Ps get at this. So I like what he says here about the wolves.
If you describe is implicit in the perception of the wolves. And if you describe that, it's a story, but it's not a story before it's described. It's whatever a story is before it's described.
Right.
It seems to me like it's something like the weights in a neural network, returning to that idea, is that...
And I was really excited to have him talk about this because he had talked about that before. Part of what's been interesting about watching him is that you can see the ideas develop. And you not only see his ideas develop or the specific ideas you're pointing to, but you can sort of go meta on it and you can see, this is how we develop ideas. So Jordan, on one hand, is developing his ideas. He's also giving us the ideas he's developing. He's also modeling how ideas get developed and refined. All of those things are happening at once. And again, this is another example of the combinatorial explosiveness because he's doing all those things at once. And he's not even thinking about, right now, okay, I'm going to model this. He might have thought about it. What's, part of the good reason to make these videos is because I'm modeling these ideas and I'm developing these ideas with others and I'm sharing these ideas so other people can push back on them. Now, at his level of his YouTube channel, he can't listen to all of the pushback and engagement that these ideas create. And, even at the small level that my channel is, I can't listen to all of the pushback and ideas that my ideas or even regurgitating Jordan's ideas create. But this is, again, part of the reason why this little corner of talking to each other and listening to each other is so important. And I think, again, this is part of the reason for the gospel seminars. One of the things that we get repeatedly is, well, why no biblical scholars? Well, it's not that biblical scholars are excluded. Well, why no women? Well, it's not that women are excluded. It's you sort of grab the people who are around you that you have a sense of, this person will be good, and off you go. And, people people have plenty of critiques about who I talk to or who I'm not talking to or who I should talk to, even again at this very low level that I do this. But
there are certain facts, let's say, that present themselves to us that are much more heavily weighted. And that's axiomatic. It's built into the system.
See, we're trying to get at this question of perception because, as he explained to Michaela, already things are filtered. And things are filtered pre-consciously. Well, how did we learn how to filter? Well, we've been working on these issues ever since we were born. When we came into the world, we already started filtering. And you can watch a baby, even a very small baby, a very young baby. They're learning how to move their hands. They're learning to filter the world. And then as they get to know their parents, this mapping that the parents are doing is a lot of filtering. This even goes to the combinatorial explosive nature of the internet. Very quickly, when they first started developing, when more and more things were sort of being put onto servers that you could access through this new thing called the internet, Yahoo and others tried to sort of organize things. These are going to be a list of links and we're going to categorize them. And so quite reasonably, they started using library models in order to try to filter, and it is a filter, to filter the internet so that you could do your relevance realization and find the things that you wanted. And then very quickly they learned that wouldn't work. And so one of the breakthroughs that Google had was Google would, in a sense, as best it could, sort of watch people looking at the internet and then beginning to say, lots of people are reading this blog. Let's weigh that heavily. And I remember listening to podcasts and things about the internet and what it is and how it works. A big part of what Google became was a filter. And you might think, no, you needed a finder. No, you need a filter. And that's what consciousness does, is it filters through and finds. Now, it's not a perfect filter, but this problem that Jordan is talking about in terms of weighing, this is what he's talking about in terms of large language models, where by trying to teach machines to think for us, or at least help us with our thinking, we're learning about the kinds of thinking we do.
And those would be facts imagine that evoke emotional response very rapidly. They're weighted, and that weighting has a biological element and a cultural element. Now, that's not a story. But if you describe that, that's what a story is.
The scientist who's studying the wolves is creating a story.
That's right.
No, not creating. I want to say constructing a story.
Yes.
But it's a story about something that's not happening, mediated through story.
Well, and you got to be careful with this constructing, because this has sort of been the modernist element that we said, well, all of the stories that we tell from the wolf's point of view, and just watch people do this. We do this so naturally. If you watch a nature documentary about wolves, you'll see, they're narrating it as it's a story, and then people say, oh, they're projecting on the wolves, and yes, they are, but again, it's really transjective, because what they're trying to make sense of what's going on in the wolves, and they're not asserting that the wolves necessarily have these stories in their mind, but there's something before the story that the wolf is acting out, and a story is basically about the best thing that we know to convey it. And this is all happening again so fast in us that we walk into a room and we're doing it. It's like you don't have to think about riding a bike. You don't have to think about swimming once you've learned it. You can talk and drive at the same time. You can do all of these things because we've taken years and we've learned it from our parents, and it's been coded into us. And you just mentioned emotions there, and emotions are going to come into it because emotions are part of it. And this is where one of the pieces that Jordan, of course, has been talking about is maturity. And he's been mapping maturity onto sort of a religious hierarchy, and noting that maturity is essential. Maturity is deeply tied to sacrifice. Maturity is central for the long-term viability of a community. And Well, this maturity comes in this process.
Stories in the wolves.
Yes, right. For the wolves, it's a pattern of behavior and a pattern of perception.
Yes.
It's not a, so imagine this is when you go to see a movie, you take on the weighting, the value structure of the protagonist. Now, human beings are very good at that. Like, we look at each other's eyes and we see what people are attending to, and we watch their patterns of attention, and we infer their valuation and their motivation.
So what he just described there is exactly how Google leapfrogged Yahoo. Because Yahoo was trying to categorize the internet. And here are websites that you can find this. Here are websites that you can find that. What Google did was follow our eyes and said, lots of people are looking at this. Lots of people are looking at that. Lots of people are looking at that. And then basically they created a filter, but it was a filter created collectively by watching us look. And what Peterson is noting is that that's already what we did. We're using each other to filter. And so now you can get a sense of exactly how cultures develop. Because cultures are this mass, we don't have, we can tell stories that give us a sense of a culture. But stories aren't a culture. Stories, if you want to know a culture, listen to their stories, because stories have a tremendous amount of stuff compressed in them. But stories are all of these little preferences, and all of these little preferences have been coded by millions of exchanges of I look at this and not at that, I look at this and not at that, I look at this and not at that, I look at this and not at that. And that looking is just the beginning, and it just grows and grows and grows.
We're unbelievably good at each other's eyes, and we see what people are attending to, and we watch their patterns of attention, and we infer their valuation and their motivation. We're unbelievably good at that. And that's what you're doing when you're going to a movie. We watch how the protagonist prioritizes his attention and his action, what his priorities are. And you infer from that the perceptual structure that, well, that's the question. Does it bring some facts to light and make others irrelevant? And if so, is it a screen? Like, most of the world we don't see. Most of the world is screened out from our perception. Some of that's biomechanical. I can't see behind my head. But
and of course, movies do this very well because, you know, one of the things that you might notice about the quality of this camera and the lens, that's why I noticed, because I usually have to set up my own shots. I have to do all of this myself. So I pay attention to lens. What lens are they using? Now, they're using a very fisheye lens, and their lens is fairly low. Movies do this. You can see that my face is in focus. There's a little square that this camera has around me to make sure that my face is in focus, and the books behind me are out of focus. Movies do that. They use this depth of field in order to focus our attention. And then, you know, music swells, or the music gets dramatic, or the music gets foreboding. They're doing all of this to focus our attention and anticipate how we're supposed to feel. And I mean, it's all of this scaffolding that it's doing. It's why movies are this astoundingly powerful communication.
But some of it is, I'm looking at you, so I can't see the faces of the cameramen right now, right? So that's a choice that's dependent on my determination of how to focus my attention. Now, the fact that I'm prioritizing you, I can see your face, I'm using the foveal center of my vision, and I can't see these guys because they're in my periphery. That's kind of like a screen, right? The place where it's most open is this central point of vision. Over here, it's obscured, and over here, it's just gone completely. So now, you objected to my characterization because you said, you know, observer, screen, reality, and you didn't like the proposition of the intermediary screen.
Yes.
And I know the screening idea isn't exactly right. But on the counter side, we have this problem. Some things are central to our perception and other things are peripheral. And that's dependent on our values and our patterns of attention and our actions. So, well, I'm curious about what you think about that.
Well, I think you're putting two kinds of examples out on the table. They're going to be related. I think the first one, where we are looking at a human being, say an actor on a screen,
right,
putting ourselves in that person's shoes.
I still don't know if I'm getting the piece of this conversation I want to get. It was earlier. but I'm going to get it in because I thought this was a great moment in the video. So doggone it, here it comes.
Psychologists who claim that because we evolved for a substantial period of time on the African plains, that our emotional and motivational systems are no longer properly adapted to the modern world. It's like, I find that that's a variant of the argument that you just laid out, and that it also has the echoes of that rationalist, some variants of rationalism, that proclamation that emotion is the enemy of reason. It's like emotions are unbelievably sophisticated. They're low resolution and they're quick. They're not as quick as, say, spinal reflexes, but they're faster than thought. And they're also broader than thought. And they also enable us to evaluate when we don't have enough information to think.
And it's interesting, then, the relationship between stories and emotions. Glenn Scrivener has been doing some videos on, I don't think euthanasia is the right word, on medical assistance in dying. Let's use the Canadian one. He's been doing some videos on that because the British Parliament recently passed laws that are to enable this. And Glenn has been taking a careful look at that conversation, and he noted that the stories lead. They lead with stories rather than arguments. Well, why? Well, it's this whole question of emotions. And I think Jordan, this is one of the most helpful things that I'd heard with respect to emotions.
And also, they're low resolution and they're quick. They're not as quick as, say, spinal reflexes, but they're faster than thought. And they're also broader than thought. And they also enable us to evaluate when we don't have enough information to think. And they...
And this is why stories are important, why stories move us. But also they can be a little bit dangerous because they're low resolution, they're quick, and especially for a distracted time and people, some good stories and some emotions can sort of lead you down a place. Now, I think what tends to happen is that in time, if the choices that are made are not correct, those things will come back again because new stories will develop. But it's very interesting, the relationship between emotions and stories.
They have their pitfalls like everything human, because nothing human is omniscient. And so we're going to make errors. But the idea that there's a fundamental antipathy between the emotional, the id, let's say, and the ego, that, because that's a variant of that psychoanalytic theory, that is a misunderstanding of the way that the nervous system is integrated. So let me run something else by you. Since we've laid out this, I want to run a proposition by you.
And then he's going to get through that. We see the world through stories, and then we're going to go through that. So I am about out of time. Still thinking if I should attempt to recreate the video that I wasn't able to fully make yesterday because I didn't look at that little blue light there that says it's recording. And so I talked and talked and talked and talked. Felt good for me. Get it off my chest. But anyway, so this will have to be it for this late Friday afternoon. I got my rough draft done. I really have to get at Lord's Day 7 of the Heidelberg Catechism. Really have to start this question. Part of my difficulty with making that video is the video is intended to be not for the kinds of people who watch all my other videos. And the kinds of work you have to do in this area. This, again, I remember when, the CRC is having this big fight about human sexuality, and Sam Tiedemann basically says, I think in a lot of ways this fight is about universalism. And when he said it, I thought, yes, you're right. And those tensions are in the corner, and it's very interesting to watch. Luke has been going after that in his morning live streams. And I think a lot of it has to do with earlier in this video when Jordan's talking to Michaela and he's talking about time, that's not disconnected from this story. And I remember the first time I heard someone say eternal conscious torment, I thought, that's a new way of talking about it. Is it right? Is that what hell is? Is that what perdition is? Anyway, enough for now. Leave a comment.